Go ahead,
Hello,
Zoe.
everyone. Hello, everyone. It's so wonderful to be here with all of you. Just a little housekeeping before we begin. You can turn off the live transcript on the bottom of the screen if you'd like by clicking live transcript. It should look like two C's next to each other. And when you click that, you can click hide subtitles. So if you don't want the subtitles, you can click there. So that being said, I actually want to start with the blessing over studying Torah, because we are going to delve into some Torah today in our talk about spirituality and Judaism. The blessing is Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav, vitzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And I've always loved the word la'asok, which means to delve, but it has in it the syllable soak, which we know in English is to really steep in something for a long time. And that's what it is to read Art Green's new book, is to really soak in our history and in the soul. It's so extraordinary. So I'm really excited. Here we are at the third annual Richard Siegel Memorial Program, Judaism for the World, Reflections of God, Life, and Love with Rabbi Arthur Green and Dr. Judith Rosenbaum. I wanted to share that this is especially meaningful because Rabbi Art Green, you were Richard's teacher, and Dr. Rosenbaum, you were his student also, and your mother was his teacher. And this reminds me of one of the verses in Talmud, which says, Rabbi Hanina said, "Much have I learned from my rabbis, even more from my colleagues, but most from my students." And that's part of the magic of Rich, because no one who is his teacher or his colleague or his student remains only that thing. Eventually, we all become his teachers because he had the humility to learn from all. We all become his colleagues because that was his belief in do-it-yourself Judaism, empowering everyone to be as rabbis for themselves. And we all become his students, always learning from him all the time. Richard Siegel, of blessed memory, relished the opportunity to learn something new or important, especially when in the company of friends. To remember Richard and his love of learning, we are presenting this memorial program. And so I want to introduce our speakers. Rabbi Green is one of the country's most important Jewish theologians, a renowned scholar of Jewish mysticism. And he is the founding dean and currently the rector of the Rabbinical School, and Irving Brudnick Professor of Jewish Philosophy and Religion at Hebrew College in Boston. He is both a historian of Jewish religion and a theologian. His work seeks to form a bridge between these two distinct fields of endeavor. He is the author of many books, including Ehyeh, A Kabbalah for Tomorrow, Radical Judaism, Seek My Face, A Jewish Mystical Theology, Your Word is Fire, The Hasidic Masters on Contemplative Prayer, and Neo-Hasidism, Roots and Branches. And I believe that all of those are on my shelves. And his newest book, Judaism for the World, Reflections of God, Life, and Love. In his newest book, Green challenges the traditional notions of God, Israel, and Torah, and we're going to explore that today. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Judith Rosenbaum. Dr. Rosenbaum is Chief Executive Officer of the Jewish Women's Archive, a pioneering national organization that documents Jewish women's stories, elevates their voices, and inspires them to be agents of change. An educator, historian, and writer, Dr. Rosenbaum served for nearly a decade as the Director of Public History and Director of Education at Jewish Women's Archive, developing its major programs and educational initiatives. Her research includes women's collective communities in Israel and the women's health movement. Her leadership of the Jewish Women's Archive has been transformative, introducing the Quarantine Book Club, the Rising Voices Fellowship for Juniors and Seniors in High School, and a stunning array of learning opportunities, the groundbreaking Shalvi Hyman Jewish Women's Encyclopedia as an example. We are so grateful to have both of you here as we remember Rich. Rich would love to be remembered in this way. And I know, Arthur, that your your wife of blessed memory, Kathy, that her yahrzeit is also this week. And so this is a time of memory and of melody for all of us. I want to also just say a couple more words about Rich. The project that Rich was working on at the end of his life was getting good at getting older. This was the project that Rich and Rabbi Laura Geller were involved in. And we all know that Rich's impact on Judaism is immeasurable. He was the co-author and publisher of the Jewish catalog, whose subtitle was A Do-It-Yourself Kit, offering instructions on everything from making a seder to crafting a talit to protesting for Soviet Jewry. And it was an instant bestseller on everybody's shelf. And that whole concept of do-it-yourself Judaism gave a generation the tools to take back Judaism from the hands of rabbis and elders and reshape it for our own time. And growing out of that, at the end of his life, Rich working with Rabbi Geller on getting good at getting older, is also a way of transforming the paradigm of aging from one of decline to one of opportunity. So all of Rich's teachings, in a way, were about challenging and transforming paradigms and offering people a do-it-yourself empowerment and access to spirituality and history. Richard died when he was 70. He was the same age as King David when King David died. And just like the dancing shepherd whose song of courage and love changed the world, Richard's song, his dance, his wisdom transcends his years and lives on through the work of our hands. And part of that work is here, High Village. The creation of High Village is one of the crowning jewels of Richard's vision, and we are living that vision. High Village, if you're visiting us, is the first synagogue-based village in the country, a partnership of two cutting-edge Reform synagogues, and it's all about believing a better experience of aging is possible, where we can grow with and rely on each other. Every day, our members come together to create new possibilities for what's next in our lives. And we really owe a great debt of thanks and gratitude to Richard for what we enjoy here together. So I've spoken a lot of words, and I want to turn it over to our speakers, to Rabbi Art Green and Dr. Judith Rosenbaum, but I thought maybe I would start with a question. Now, Rabbi Green, in your book, which I just love, and it's filled with highlights and underlines, and the pages are already a little tattered from so much flipping. You have a chapter called How I Practice Judaism and Why. And in it, you define yourself as a but you also say you don't like labels. So you reluctantly define yourself as a neo-Hasidic heterodox traditionalist. So there's a lot to unpack with all of these words. And you add in the chapter, my Judaism has not been centrally given to the question of authority, nor is it primarily focused on the details of proper observance. And I just share this at the beginning because I'm curious how much of that philosophy of Judaism, and I open this also to you, Dr. Rosenbaum, as well, how much of your approach to Judaism is related to having known Rich and his influence in your lives?
Thank you. Wonderful to be here. First of all, I just want to say what an honor it is to do this for my dear friend and student Rich, and for my friend Laura, and it's great to be with you on this very special occasion. Well, I would say that Rich was part of this group. This was Chavurah Judaism. This was the Judaism we created for ourselves around Chavurah Shalom in the beginning of 1968. Rich was a senior in college that year, and I got to know him. I was a recent graduate of rabbinical school. I had known Rich's older brother, by the way, as an undergraduate at Brandeis, and so that just dates me in terms of age group. But Rich was a senior in college. He was one of those people interested in joining our Chavurah. He did the Jewish catalog draft as a BA thesis, as I remember, maybe as an MA thesis at Brandeis. And he and George Savrin did it together. And that was a very interesting attempt. It was in some ways already a reflection of the kind of do-it-yourself Judaism that we were creating. We were saying in the Chavurah that a group of people could get together who had some Jewish roots and cared about one another and were really devoted to doing Judaism and didn't need to have a formal rabbi or a synagogue or authority to do things. And we would do things in the way of our generation. And I was already a student of Hasidus and then was hearing the echoes of the early Hasidic masters in the 18th century who were saying, well, every generation has to do it differently, has a unique voice and has a unique reading of the Torah. And I was translating that and saying, well, that's true of our generation too. And Rich was one of the eager consumers of that message, but then one of the people who helped transform it and pass it on as well. Jude?
I can pick it up by, of course, also echoing that it is really an honor and a privilege to be here, be in conversation with all of you, and be here in memory of Rich, who was someone I knew from my childhood in the Chavurah movement. And so growing up as a child of the Chavurah, I actually didn't know that what I was coming of age in was countercultural or new or marginal in any way. To me, it was Judaism. It was what Judaism was and had always been, and was a tremendous gift to grow into a sense of community that owned its own authority and presented its creativity as absolutely essential to what Judaism was. And then actually, Rich was also my first boss in my first job at the Foundation for Jewish Culture, where he also, brought his just delight and interest in people, and his creativity and his vision for what Jewish community could be and the role of art and culture in that. And so I feel very lucky to have been shaped by that, and I try to carry that on in my own work and my own Jewish life right now as well. And it's wonderful to be able to be in conversation with you, Art, because I get to be in conversation with you all the time, but not in a formal way. And so to have this chance to read your book with a different eye and to be able to ask you questions about it, not over the Shabbos table, but over Zoom is a great opportunity. So thank you for enabling this. And I want to start with just a simple question to you that, maybe it's not, there are no simple questions, but a question that occurred to me as I started to delve into your book, which is, made up of theological and personal essays and reflections. And you frame it very much as a record of your personal journey. And you organize it around the themes of soul, year, and world, but you call it Judaism for the world, right? And yet you frame it very much as a kind of individual seeker's tale. So I'm curious about how you think about that relationship between the individual search and the global Jewish story that you are also part of.
Great, wonderful way to start. Well, let me say first, I was trained to be a scholar. I got my PhD at Brandeis from a very respectable scholar of Jewish intellectual history, and I was supposed to be an academic. And at some point, I was teaching at the University of Pennsylvania sometime in the mid-1970s or early 80s. And I looked around at my students and I said, these people are already fourth and fifth generation American Jews. Why are they going to remain Jewish? What's the future of this tradition? I am the Jew I am because I still remember East European Jewish grandparents and the old world and Yiddish and all those kinds of things. But they have none of that. What's going to be the future? Then I published a book on the history of the motif of the crown and early Jewish mysticism. Princeton University Press, very prestigious. They told me they sold 1,000 copies, which made 800 to libraries and about 200 to people. And I said, oh, where is this going? What is the future of this enterprise of Jewish scholarship? And then I began trying to write something personal. I did a personal theology book called Seek My Face. And people said to me, that book changed my life. And I said, wow, I guess you should write books that people want to read. What an interesting discovery for a scholar. And then I began writing more personal books. But theology has always, for me, been a very personal enterprise. I don't know how to do theology any other way. I can do scholarship in a very clean academic way as a historian. But when it comes to theology, all I can talk about is my own experience of life and my own religious experience, my inner experience. And then the theological ideas have to be based on that evidence. So I can only do it in a personal way. When I say Judaism for the world, it's kind of a chutzpah, because there must be other people out there who would resonate with this. I'm tossing it out to the world. I'm giving it to you. I'm giving you this glimpse into my own inner life and my own inner journey. And I think some of you are going to find it interesting, and some of you are going to find echoes of your own journeys in it. And I hope not all of you will be Jewish. I hope some of you will be Christians or others who have struggled with tradition, who have struggled with ideas, with what you mean by God, with how to pray if you're not a literal believer, etc., etc. And this will have some resonance for you. So, in a sense, all I can share with the world is myself, and that's what I try to do in this kind of religious language.
And I loved also that you, very much in line with that thinking, you put the two essays that are sort of your own personal memoirs about your Jewish education and your rabbinate actually towards the end of the book in the section about the world, which seemed to me to make sense as it fits into that you start with very personal ideas and then you kind of come around, and this very much resonates with me as a historian, to saying, oh well, actually, you know what, if I'm gonna give you my my chap on the whole, my take on how theology works and how the universe works, actually probably I need to tell you where I'm coming from and what my trajectory was in the more personal terms that are not abstract but really are just, I learned from this person and I had this experience at Camp Ramah, and that each of those kind of led to led to where you are, so that it in some ways it then circles back around, because it's an invitation then to explore how much you've grounded your own theology in the personal.
I guess when I say personal, I don't mean that I want it to be all about me. And that's why those things were saved for the end, almost as afterthoughts. Well, if you want to know something about me, here's something about my own Jewish education, etc., and my personal journey. But I really want to talk about when I say personal, I mean what I mean by the inner life and what my experience of the inner life is, and how I see religion as evocative of the call to cultivate an inward journey. And in that sense, very personal, but not this happened to me when I was 10 and that happened to me when I was 14. And the sort of, otherwise it becomes a little bit egotistical, a little bit self-centered. So it is intimate, personal, without wanting to be my own story, self-centered. But then at the end, some of that creeps in indeed. And I think it has to, as you say.
Right. And I think, when we think about, for example, the Chavra movement and the Jewish counterculture, that's very clear, because there's one way of talking about the Jewish counterculture that situates it only in the historical moment. And certainly reading those more memoir type pieces in your book, it's sort of like a who's who of mid 20th century Jewish scholarly life. And in some ways, I could almost imagine the movie version, which is a little bit like Forrest Gump in some ways, where you're at every place where something interesting and some interesting figure who was a European refugee comes over and is part of that story. But of course, that is one piece of what Judaism as a counterculture is, when the part that was connected to the American counterculture of the 60s and 70s. But you're actually, I think, talking about something much deeper, which is the countercultural aspects of Judaism writ large, not Judaism as it related to that particular historical countercultural moment. So I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about that, sort of where you see those Jewish countercultural impulses, how you define them, and where you see them kind of playing out today, either as you see them actually happening or where you think aspirationally they should be headed.
In the second year of the Chavurah, that was the first year Rich was part of it, a young man showed up on our doorstep. He was a Jewish graduate student from Germany. He was quite Orthodox and therefore never spent a Shabbat with us, but he was interested in writing a sociological doctorate on the American Jewish counterculture. That's where we first became conscious of the word counterculture, and that we were a countercultural institution. He wrote in German, Die Jüdische Gegenkultur, I remember, the Jewish counterculture in Germany. And we translated that back. So, oh yes, of course we are countercultural. But we were all reading a book by Theodore Rozek in those days called The Making of a Counterculture. But counterculture, as I say in that essay, goes back to the story of Abraham, where it says, the Midrash says, why was Abraham called Ivri? Ivri, which can be taken to be from the word avor, to transgress, to be on the other side. Avera is a transgression. It says the whole world was on one side and Abraham stood on the other side. And I have a sense that Judaism has been that functionally for a very long time, especially because first we were defined. I mean, you read this week's Parsha, for goodness sake, we were defined by our opposition to pagan society, destroy those idols and so on. And then for 1700 years, we're a minority in either a Christian or an Islamic surrounding, both of which saw themselves as superseding us and having better religions and better truth. And we stood up and were against the majority culture. We were countercultural. We were a countercultural force. We were always a thorn in the side of the people who thought they knew everything. And I talk about how in the modern world, in some ways, you watch Jews become a counterculture, whether it's the leftist counterculture, the Jewish Marxist counterculture, or just the avant-garde in arts and literature, how much Jews have been a kind of countercultural force. So this age when counterculture really became ripe in the late 1960s, that was so much for us, but it also had these deep roots in the tradition. I was a very close student. I had the great privilege of being a very close student of Abraham Joshua Heschel. And Heschel was clearly a counterculture figure in America. He was in some ways an early, what they now call post-secularist, defying the values of secular culture and saying, we stand for something else. We stand for the sacred dimension in human life. And that in itself is countercultural. And we in the Chavurah, when we said, we stand over against the conventional synagogue, we are looking for a more intimate and more authentic and simpler and less pretentious form of Jewish community than the American synagogue of the 50s and 60s had been. We were embodying that in some ways. So yeah, that's a big part of our definition.
In one of your essays, I don't remember which one, you talk about that potentially being in some ways the purpose of Jews, right? That Jews have perhaps are here in some way to represent some of those countercultural forces and values in every moment.
I think so, to remind people. Yes, now we live in such a very materialistic culture. We live in such a very violent culture. I don't have to give you the list of things: the degradation of sexuality, especially of women's lives, women's bodies, the terrible violence we have. That I can't turn on Netflix without seeing guns everywhere I go. Everywhere I go, people are killing each other. That's what entertainment is about. I watch with horror some of the computer games my grandson plays, etc., etc. And you see how much there is to oppose in this society. So to say we stand for a different set of values, and that's what Judaism is about, seems to me a blessed part of our faith. That's what we're here for. We are here to stand up and say, no, we stand for something else. And that's been part of our definition, as I say, since the beginning, I think.
So I think one of the challenges that raises, and this is something that I think about a lot as somebody who, as I said, came of age thinking that the Jewish countercultural values that I was raised with were in fact normative.
Mm-hmm.
And you write about how part of what defines a religious community is shared language for talking about God and values and morality. So the problem to me, or the question really that I struggle with here, and I see emerging in your book, is what happens when we are in the same community as people who may not share that language, or they use the same language, but what they mean by that language is something very different and maybe does not represent the same values or the same countercultural impulses.
It's not easy. I'm just back from a 2.5-week trip to Europe, as you know, and I was traveling with a young man who was very helpful to me, who's very close to the ultra-Orthodox communities in Europe. So we spent a Shabbat in Vienna with the kind of remains of the Hasidic community of southern Poland, of Galicia, who have now gathered again in Vienna. About 4,000 Jews in Vienna. About 4,000 Jews in that community, I think, or 3,000 Jews in that community. Very impressive little community. And I went to their shul and ate at their homes and did exactly the same things they do. And my views of the world, my views of non-Jews, my views of women, my views of so many things are so very different. I had the experience a few years ago. I spent about 5 years translating my very favorite of the Hasidic classics into English, a book called The Light of the Eyes, published by Stanford this year, a major work of early Hasidism. And while I was working on that book for 4 or 5 years, I used a Hebrew edition of it. And I turned the flyleaf over one day and I saw there's a name and address of the editor on the back of the title page. So I said, oh, I was in Jerusalem. I said, I think I'll call him up. And I did, and I explained to him I'm a scholar of Hasidism, and I'm working on this book that you edited, and I've used your edition. It's very lovely. Could we talk about it? And he very generously said, yes, come over Saturday night after Shabbos. I'll be very happy to. Well, I find his home in a block near Mea Sharim. He's with a great big shtreimel, still best dressed for Shabbos. He was a skverer chassid. And we had about a 45-minute or an hour conversation in Yiddish, which was very nice because I rarely have conversations in Yiddish and love doing so. And I realized after that time how very little we had in common. It was impossible to imagine that we had read the same book. He was saying, oh, of course these people were all tzaddikim. Of course they all believe the same thing. Of course everything is true and everything is perfect and blah, 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 blah. And I was interested in how this book contradicts that book. And was this written after so and so? And we couldn't possibly have read the same volume. Well, I felt that again in Vienna, and I feel that often. I'm a very traditionally observant Jew, and I've chosen to do that in this period of my life. But I mean something so different by it, as you see in this book, than do 95% of the people who observe those traditions. Sometimes I wonder what I'm doing here. Sometimes I wonder whether I'm kidding myself or whether I'm a voice of change and of growth in this tradition. Whether sometime after I'm gone, people will start picking up my books in larger numbers and learn something from me, or whether I'm a kind of voice in the wilderness who is looking for some different kind of Judaism that really doesn't work very well because so few people have discovered it. I don't know. It is sometimes lonely out here.
Well, I will say, I couldn't go into those spaces and have those conversations with the other people who are engaging with those works. So what you've done is make it possible for so many more people to access those. And of course, I couldn't access those not only because I couldn't have a 45-minute conversation in Yiddish, but because he would never speak to me because I'm a woman and I couldn't show up at his door and be taken seriously in the same way. And I think my on one foot answer to that question, that you're posing, is that it will mean something and it will mean something different because there isn't one meaning that these texts hold, right? I think part of what you're showing is that they actually have part of what makes these texts incredibly valuable is that they have the capacity to hold multiple interpretations or multiple meanings, and what they mean in one context isn't going to be what they mean maybe to the next generation, and that next generation would never be able to tease out those meanings without your translation work, right? That both in terms of literal translation, but also in terms of putting it into a new framework that allows that countercultural impulse to come through.
I'm a believer in evolution, and my approach to Judaism is also evolutionary. I believe, as I say in the beginning of Radical Judaism, that evolution, the story of evolution, I believe is the great sacred narrative of our time. And so I think Judaism is evolving. I think the idea that I would hand over to my grandchildren the same Yiddishkeit that I loved that my grandparents gave to me, I would be giving them Judaism in formaldehyde. I would be giving them Judaism as preserved from the past. We have to make it better in each generation. We have to expand it and change it. I mean, you've seen the tremendous change in the participation of women in Jewish life that's happened in the last 40 years. I've seen that, of course, but I've also seen the tremendous change of Judaism and the reclaiming of the mystical tradition that's been happening over the last 20 years or 25 years. And those are going to be very different Judaisms. Needless to say, Zionism and Israel and its effect on Jewish life and so on. My grandparents' Judaism, my grandparents came from Shtetlach in Eastern Europe and still spoke Yiddish and had memories of Judaism in the old country. And this is the way we used to do it in Deheim, back home. And that was all very lovely, but it certainly is not what my grandchildren need. And so realizing we are part of an evolutionary process, which is biological. We live for a split second on the face of this earth in environmental time, in evolutionary time, and we're here to do something. But the species and the tradition and the culture and the faith should somehow be improved for the next generation. Be something the next generation is able to digest. So that's the work.
And I think one of the things that the I was going to say return to mysticism, but the kind of renewal of the mystical tradition in contemporary Jewish life has given us is the language of love, which is something that I think many of us don't associate with Judaism, right? We think of Christianity as being the religion of love, and we think of Judaism as bringing many other wonderful values, but love is not the primary one that we usually operate from, though it certainly is present in our daily liturgy. But you write so much about Judaism as a path of love in this book. And so tell us a little bit about how you see love in Judaism.
Well, you're right, first of all, that yes, it was Christians who said Christianity is the religion of love, whereas Judaism is the religion of the harsh God of the Old Testament, the punishing God. And of course, that's a stereotype we reject. Remember that indeed Jesus in the New Testament says um, that the love of God and the love of neighbor is the essence of the teaching, is the essence of the Torah. But Rabbi Akiva also said, "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha," love your neighbor as yourself, is the most basic principle of Torah. And Hillel, who came before Jesus, said, "Well, do not to your neighbor what you wouldn't have done to you." So there was an age of change. I would say all of the heirs of biblical Judaism around the first century were discovering the centrality of love. But I think now, so why should we be Jewish? These kids I saw at Penn, why should they stay Jewish? I think the only reason to continue this tradition is because we love it. Nobody wants to stay loyal to this tradition anymore because you're going to be punished, because God's going to punish you. None of us believe that. None of us believe you must do it out of guilt over the Holocaust. That's not going to work anymore as a way to educate our children. Nobody's going to say, well, you can't do it because the Shulchan Aruch, the law code, says you have to do it this way. There is no other reason to remain involved with a tradition other than love. Now, that's love for the traditional forms themselves, which I have lots of, thank God, but it's also, I think, a way of expressing our love of God, or our love of life, or our love of the one, or our love of existence, or whatever you want to say. We are blessed. We are blessed with tremendous gifts. For me, the beginning of religion is gratitude. Here I am alive, relatively healthy. I have things I'm sad about, the loss of my wife and lots of other things, but I'm 80 years old and I'm alive and healthy. And what do I do with that gratitude? I would have to invent God to have somebody to be grateful to. Or maybe I do invent God to have somebody to be grateful to. Or maybe that gratitude is God somehow. Maybe there's something divine about that feeling of gratitude. And religion is a way of expressing it. And so that gratitude leads me to love. It leads me to love of the world and love of people around me. I say, if I'm grateful for my existence, what can I do about it? What I can do about it is share that love with other people, and share that love with those around me, and share that love with those who need it. And so I sort of become a lover. As I said in the essay about rabbis, don't use this as a bumper sticker in your synagogue parking lot, but how about rabbis are great lovers? Which means we love the world, which means we love our communities, which means it's all about a career of love. And I think it is. So that's what I have been doing. Now, I have spent many years studying the place of the Song of Songs in the literature of Judaism. I have 3 or 4 important articles in my CV on Judaism and the Song of Songs in early Jewish mysticism, and the one medieval manuscript I edited was a commentary on the Song of Songs. I have upstairs in this house a collection of commentaries on the Song of Songs, and that, of course, is the central book of love in Judaism. God and Israel, or God and the soul, love one another as lover and beloved. And so that's a very central rubric for me in Judaism. It's been forgotten too much. In Judaism, the metaphors of God as Father and God of King, and King and Father and King, Avinu Malkeinu, are so well remembered, but God as lover, which is lover and spouse, which is very much a part of the Jewish tradition, has in some ways been lost. And recovering it for Judaism is part of my mission.
One of my favorite things about Shabbat dinner at your house when Kathy was still alive was that you and she would chant verses from Shir Hashirim, from Song of Songs, to one another as part of the Shabbat table liturgy, and it was so beautiful and such a
I sometimes still do it. Yeah.
So, but of course, one sort of wrinkle to add into that, I think that this question about love calls is, Song of Songs is about special love. It's about the special love between two figures, right? However you understand those two figures. It's not about a love that is a universal love. It is about a love that is not accessible to everyone. So I think one of the questions about love is really how you deal with that question of the universal and the particular, between loving all people versus loving God in a special way, or loving all Jews in a special way. And before you talked about Rabbi Akiva and the idea that the foundation of Judaism is loving your neighbor as yourself. And there's also there are lots of opinions about what the foundation is. Ben Azai says that the foundation is really that everybody is created in God's image. So how do you think about love and this question between the universal and the particular?
I think I'm going to make a statement, and then I'm going to have to define what I mean and what I don't mean by it. I think God loves each of us in a particular way. God loves each of us in a particular way. What do I mean by that? I don't believe in the old fellow in the sky, and my God is very far from the old fellow in the sky of people's childhoods. What I mean by that is the force, the single force that underlies all of being, is present in each individual creature. That one, the one of the cosmos, has decided on this planet, we don't understand why, for the last several billion years, to enter into this evolutionary project called life. And life keeps growing and changing, and more forms of life keep happening. Plants and animals and dinosaurs and eventually humans. And each of them is a hitlabshut, is a garbing of that one. That one is present in every form that exists. Why is it present in every form that exists? Because it somehow wants to be, or it delights in being. It somehow seems to like variety. It creates so many different kinds of flowers and so many different kinds of bugs and so many different kinds of mosquitoes and so many different kinds of humans. It seems to want to be in each one of them and see each one of them as somehow individual and different. And so if it wants to be in each of those forms, I can say, I metaphorically say, or I translate that into the language of it loves each of those for the second that it exists in evolutionary time. It loves being in that form. It loves putting on this thing called Art Green and Judith Rosenbaum. It just sort of enters into that in love, and we can only respond in love. And we can only respond in love, which is then acted out toward love of God's creatures, since God doesn't need us to love God. God needs us to act with compassion and love toward other creatures, which also have the Spirit of God in them. And so then we become in gratitude in response to the love that allows us to exist, that allowed this conception to happen. Because the meeting of that sperm and egg that conceived each of us was, I believe, a miraculous event, a somehow transcendent event. And we respond to that gift of life by loving others, by passing on that love. And so I think we are given here's a theology of biology, you might say, if you want. I think we are given the device of desire, sexual desire, which becomes love, which we refine into the love of a person and a life of love, to teach us something about how to love so that we will love others, so that we will love the world. I think there is a growth from biological basis of love to a transcendent love that goes beyond the love that is just bodily attraction. I like to say that Sigmund Freud and the Baal Shem Tov, two Jewish spiritual teachers from the same region, only 100 years or so apart, both had the same idea, that love is a continuum. Freud said it begins with eros, it begins with sexual desire, and then it gets refined and sublimated into art and into literature and into finally the most absurd of all loves, the future of an illusion, which is religious love, which is a love of what Freud would say is nothing. And God and the Baal Shem Tov would say there is the love of God, and it comes down into the world and is manifest in human love, it is manifest in animal love, it is manifest in other words, whether you start from the top or start from the bottom of the pyramid, they both believe that eros slash love slash divine love is one continuum. Sorry for that long lecture.
No, the biological piece that you're talking about also reminds me of something last, to not put this in too strange terms, but last summer, in the kind of heat of anxiety about COVID, or what I guess was only the beginning of it, but felt like we were deep in it at the time. I remember having this moment of thinking, how do we shift out of this anxiety? And I thought, here we are feeling so scared of this virus. And what if we just thought of the virus as something that it's just doing its job? Its job is to replicate and spread and survive. And it's doing its biological job, which is to keep, spreading.
Just like we do ours.
Just as we do ours, which is to try to survive it, and that reframe was actually helpful, I think, because it did bring into it that sense of just, I wouldn't have put the terms into love, but seeing it as part of a natural order of the world and an environment that that functions and that is miraculous, even in its negative aspects, like viruses that kill people. And to see that impulse in everything does create a sense of connection, even with the things that are our enemies, like a virus or like other people whom we might also put into that category. And so it requires us to step out of the usual more combative frameworks and think of things as being part of the same environmental family in some way that we are part of, which I think speaks a little bit to what you were getting at as well.
Yes, I agree. We live in a universe where we are all doing our thing and reproducing as our thing, and yet sometimes we have to stand up against. We have to fight that virus. And in the human world too, I believe there is such a thing as evil. Yes, we have to sometimes stand up against. I'm not an absolute pacifist for that reason. I think there's times when we have to defend ourselves and have to survive. But yes, all of us are involved in that life of reproduction and self-continuation, of course.
I think also the notion of gratitude, which you're saying here is sort of the beginning of that awakening of love, or where the force of love can kind of build some momentum. You also talk about that as in many ways the starting point of prayer for you.
Mm-hmm.
And you write a lot here about the importance of prayer in your life, and what you see as the kind of cultivating the role of prayer in cultivating a meaningful Jewish life in general. One of the lines that I loved in your writing about prayer was you said that we have to grow constantly in our life of prayer. So, and I think it's sometimes we forget that, because especially, Jews who pray from a Siddur, it feels a little bit set, right? We have a matbea shel tefillah. We have a set way that we're supposed to pray, and it's very orderly. So tell us a little bit about what you mean by prayer, by growing in our life of prayer. What does that mean, and how does one do it?
I first want to share a memory, because hearing the question and looking at Laura, I'm remembering a memory of Rich. We are now in 1970, I would say, maybe the third year of the Chavurah. It was the first time that a few of us decided to begin a regular practice of meditation. And there were 4 of us who met every morning in the Chavurah prayer room. Must have been for 8 o'clock in the morning. Kathy, myself, Janet, and Rich. Janet was the wife of our Chavurah member Barry Holtz in those days, Janet Wolf. And the 4 of us met for meditation every morning, and a little bit of chanting after meditation, I think. And Rich was one of the people in that period who really took the inner life of prayer very seriously. and was really trying to become a more praying Jew in a new way. So that's a memory to share. Uh, I have an essay in this book called How I Pray. One of the things I say there is what prayer isn't, what prayer is not. So I tell a story there. There's a chassid who's wandering around Grand Central Station doing business, done a whole day of business in New York, and suddenly he looks at his watch and he says, "Oh, it's 6:20 in the afternoon, and I haven't davened mincha yet. It must have been in the spring or fall. I haven't said my afternoon prayers yet. And so what should I do?" And he's a little bit embarrassed to just stand up in the middle of Grand Central Station and start chuckling and start saying his prayers. So he looks around. He sees there are 100 people around him with phones talking on the phones. So he picks up his phone and says, he starts davening mincha into the phone. What prayer isn't is the question, is there anybody on the other end of the line? And if there's nobody on the other end of the line, he must be crazy, because you don't talk if there's nobody on the other end of the line. That's not what prayer is. Is God listening or isn't God listening on the other end of the line? That's not what prayer is. That's what most people think prayer is, and that's why they lose it. The very first book I wrote, it was with this friend Janet and her then husband, Barry. The four of us had a house on the coast of Maine, the summer of 1969. And I translated a book of meditations on Hasidic meditations on prayer. They were things I had studied with Heschel. And my very favorite was a one-liner from Rabbi Pinchas of Koretz, one of the early Hasidic masters. He said this, he says, "People think you pray to God, and that is not true. But rather, prayer itself is the essence of God. Atfilah hi etzem elahut mamash. Prayer itself is of the essence of God. The act of praying is an act in which God is present. There is something sacred about opening your heart. There is something sacred about opening your heart and bringing it out into language. There is something sacred about using the ancient tools of your people's language to express the deepest and most hidden things in your heart. That's what prayer is. Prayer is being able to turn inward, to cultivate that inner life that I talk about so much, and to bring it forth and to share it with others, with a community, with the universe. And its only reward is the reward of doing it. We are now in Elul, and we're saying that wonderful psalm which says, "Achat sha'alti," I only ask one thing of God, to dwell in the house of God forever. The only thing I want out of prayer is to keep doing it, is to be in your presence. I'm not looking for goodies. I'm not looking for prizes for being the best prayer. I'm looking only for the pleasure and the beauty of being in your presence, of dwelling in your house forever. And that's what prayer is, expressing that longing and sharing that longing. I'm just turning around and I say, from that group of the four of us who are in the Chavorah together praying, here on my wall is a Jewish meditation chart. It's called a Shiviti, that was written by Janet, the fourth partner in that group with Richie, Kathy, and me, and it still hangs on my wall, a handmade meditation chart to look at as we pray. So you see, it's a small world, and there's much continuity between past and present for me.
I loved how you wrote, and you just referenced this also, that prayer is sparked by longing, but that the point of prayer is not to quench that longing, but actually to renew it in some ways, right? To
stimulate that longing, to keep stimulating that longing. Yes, that's right.
And I think that speaks very much to that sense of awareness of presence, because you're not looking to close anything with prayer. You're looking to just continue that. But how then do you think, you write a lot about prayer, mostly in these very kind of personal terms. How do you think about that in the context of communal prayer, which is such a huge piece of our prayer life as Jews?
Yes, well, first of all, I want to tell you how worried I am by what's happened in this COVID year, because I have spent the last 40 years trying to tell non-Orthodox American Jews that prayer is not a spectator sport. You don't go to watch the rabbi and the cantor up there praying. You go to do it yourself. And when it's on Zoom, of course, it's all spectator sport. There's nothing else because you're washing your dishes while it's happening, or you're doing whatever you're doing while it's happening. You're safely muted, and it becomes purely a maybe sometimes spectator sport. So I'm very worried about the migration to the Zoom world for prayer. But even in communal prayer and communal spaces, it's hard. We have become very formalized in prayer, overly formalized. That's broken down somewhat. When I was a kid, the liberal synagogue in America was a deadly place. It was very formal. You had to behave properly. You had to stand up at the right places and sit down at the right places. Men couldn't go without a tie and jacket, and all those women with fur coats you remember in the 1950s and 60s synagogue, it being a sort of show place for fancy dress. All that has changed, I think, and the Chavurah movement, I like to think, had something to do with that. It was part of that period of change. The replacement of the organ with the guitar is a very significant moment because organ music you listen to passively, and guitar strumming is meant at least to have you join in. So I think there is some change in the synagogue in communal prayer, but making communal prayer serious. Can you, in the synagogue setting, really pray? Not often, not easily. Not many rabbis have learned how to do that well, how to really stimulate prayer in the synagogue. I think one of the things the synagogue needs is chavurot, is small groups of people who can talk about these things and encourage one another and build the bigger community out of their smaller communities. I've always believed in concentric circles. You have a chavurah who are a group of maybe 5 or 10 people you can really talk to. Maybe you have a chavrusa who's 1 or 2 people you can really talk to. Then you have a group of 5 or 10, and then you have the people who show up on Shabbat morning in your synagogue, and then you have the broader membership, and then you have the broader Jewish community, and your connection to the outer circles works well because of the innermost circles. And when you just have, oh, you're a synagogue member because you pay dues, and you're on the membership list, that doesn't give you very much. And communal prayer, when you haven't spent some real time cultivating what prayer is, doesn't give you very much. So there's a lot to do. Now I have, for the past 20 years, among other projects, been working on my own commentary on the prayer book, on the traditional Jewish prayer book. And I'm now just about wound it up, and it's going to be published, I'm happy to say. And that commentary is a link between what I mean spiritually and what the words say, because there's a very great distance between what I mean and what the words say, and that commentary is the bridge. So I'm hoping that commentary will be useful for people in asking when they sit in synagogue and are able to look at it and say maybe they can find their way into the book through some of my comments.
Yes, well, it is an interesting thing about language. So many people I think have trouble praying in Jewish context because they don't have access to the liturgy. They don't understand the original. They don't maybe the translations are stilted. I remember at a certain point, as I was growing up, as my Hebrew got better and I began to understand the prayers more, that actually became a problem, because then I was distracted by what the prayers actually said, which did not necessarily resonate with me. And then it was a whole process of then figuring out how I could create that distance again, or understand them in my own way. So I'm sure your commentary will be helpful in that, and also point out to many people just where those gulfs lie. But I think one of the things that you wrote about beautifully in talking about the your own experiences of synagogues growing up is, you talk about the kind of emotional authenticity that you found in your grandparents' shul, and how that felt like a real Jewish rich experience for you. And I think that piece about vulnerability is huge, right? So much of what you're talking about in prayer life is really about bringing your greatest vulnerability to the fore and leaning into it, whether it's a positive sense of gratitude, or whether it's a sense of longing and crying out from loss. And so, to me, I think that sense of how you cultivate those kinds of communal spaces where real prayer can happen is spaces where there is that vulnerability, there is room for that kind of vulnerability, and where there's permission and an invitation even to express it in some real way.
One of the ways I defined the Chavurah was a shtibel for non-Orthodox Jews. A shtibel is a little informal prayer room. Why should synagogues for non-Orthodox Jews have to be big and fancy works of architecture, and not just a room where 20 people huddle together who know each other well and pray? And so the Chavurah is a kind of shtibel, very informal prayer space for non-Orthodox Jews. Yeah. I still, 50 years or more later, I still have those questions.
And this is a good moment to explore them in terms of our yearly calendar. We didn't get to talk about this piece, but as you referenced, we're at the beginning of Elul, of the beginning of the season leading into Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which are moments, if you allow them to be, that require deep vulnerability and a sense of admission in a collective voice, of where we fall short and what our biggest hopes and dreams are and what our biggest fears are. And so it's certainly, if people are ready to experiment with vulnerability in prayer, it certainly is the right time to lean into that, I think.
Indeed it is. Let's leave it at that.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. I want to open up our conversation to those who have joined us. So I invite you, if you have questions, to put them in the chat. And as you're thinking about your questions, I wanted to make a comment. You mentioned in your book fleetingly that you were working on this companion to the traditional prayer book. And you said that the name of, I don't know if it's still a working title, if you're still calling it Be'er Lahai Ro'i. And is it still the title?
Yes.
I just wanted to say that for those who don't know, it's mentioned briefly in the Torah 2 times. It's mentioned when Hagar is afraid for her life and she thinks that she's going to die in the desert, and she cries out to God, and God hears her, and she names this well, the well of the God who sees me. It's such a beautiful name. And it's mentioned again when Isaac is wandering and contemplating his sorrow. And it's in that place that he meets the love of his life, Rebecca. And so in a way, the name captures both the longing and the love that you so beautifully put forth in the philosophy of your book. So I just wanted to pick up on that little detail.
Thank you. Remember, Be'er is also, if you vocalize it differently, it's Be'ur. It's the commentary in which God sees me.
Oh, that's beautiful.
And maybe L'chai Ro'i, it's not quite, if God sees me or I see God, who's seeing whom is not quite clear in that phrase. So it's the ambiguity of it is what it's all about. Yeah.
So while we're collecting some questions, I thought that it might be nice to, I have four, I said verses, but that's how I read your book. 4 excerpts, little excerpts from your book. And I thought I'd take a moment and just share my screen and share, just for those who have read it or who haven't read it, just a little tiny taste of the abundant gems that are found in your work. And then we'll open it up to these questions. So the first question is, the first quote that I wanted to share is this one. I understand religion as a set of tools for the purpose of cultivating interiority. It's just such a beautiful, in a short phrase, such a beautiful concept. I'd never heard the word interiority before, but that sense of beautiful innerness. I'm going to share these 4 little excerpts and then give you an opportunity to share anything you want in response, and then we'll open to the questions. The second one that I wanted to share is, I do not believe in you. Just a very bold thing to say. Talking to God, I do not believe in you, but my life is saved because I do not believe in believing either. Believing has about it the air of intellectual proposition, a claim that cannot be proven, and it therefore is a matter of mere belief. But you are on the other end of that spectrum of doubt, belief, and certainty. You are above the line rather than below, or vice versa. I do not believe in you. I know you. And if you notice, that's not not a mistake in my typing. The capital U becomes a lowercase u when you talk about knowing. I know you, God, as I know myself, since this little individual human self is so very obviously a part and a reflection of the universal self, of the one that underlies and overlays and precedes and follows and surrounds and fills and laughs and cries within all that is, was, will be. That is more than a belief. It is a knowing, a message from the root of my contemplative soul, one that I have sought long and hard to escape so many times, but to which I always return. And the other, and then we have later in your letter to Israelis, this excerpt, Israel, which I find so beautiful in this compact little paragraph. Israel, and with it much of the Jewish people, is stricken with that same moral blindness. We have won the war with the Palestinians. We have won it over and over again. It is time to declare victory and to do what a noble victor does, to act generously, to open our hearts to the wounds and needs of the other, with whom we are destined to live side by side. And you say that speaking as an American, seeing the results of not dealing with and making reparations for our own sins. And then finally, in a section on healing, the broken heart, if not embittered and hard crusted, becomes the open heart. I'm sorry for my typo. The broken heart, if not embittered and hard crusted, becomes the open heart. So those were some of the little gems that out of a multitude that stood out to me that I wanted to share. And so I'll give, if there are any that you want to just respond to, and then we'll open up to the questions.
Oh, that's fine. It's very interesting to see your choice. That's something, and in the many such conversations I've had, nobody has done, and it's very interesting to see what you chose. Let me just take this opportunity to say hello to lots of old friends I now see on this screen now that I've had a chance to look at the gallery. And so greetings to everybody. Shalom, shalom, l'arachok lakarov. And let's hear some questions, sure.
Okay, great. So what is your sense of using social media for prayer, these coming together through Zoom or other platforms?
Well, there's good news and there's bad news. For prayer, I think it's terrible. I just don't think it works in prayer because as I said, it becomes spectator sport. You become overly passive in it. You can't even sing together because that, as you know, is off on timing. Mm-hmm. And you are just watching it. I'm very worried about the future of the liberal synagogue in the post-COVID era, and churches as well. Will people come back? And will people come back to their own community synagogue, Beth Israel of Oshkosh, when they've had a chance for a year to watch what's going on at BJ or Romamu or Ikar or one of those hotshot places?
Or Isaiah, or Emmanuel.
Will they come back to Beth Israel of Oshkosh? Well, I don't think anybody knows the answer to that. Mm-hmm. And Oshkosh needs to be a real religious community, real live human beings who care about each other. Mm-hmm. And those people you met only on Zoom aren't going to be there for your shiva. Pardon my saying it so coarsely. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so I think one of the things that religious groups have to offer is real human community. That's what you've been engaged in Chai Village, real human community. And when real human community is replaced by Zoom community, it's scary. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, for learning and teaching, it sometimes is wonderful. I taught Zoom classes on my Morinayim translation with people participating in Mexico City and Paris and California and New York and Jerusalem. And I did it at 12:30 in the afternoon here in Boston. So it was 9:30 in California and 8:30 p.m. in Jerusalem and every place in between. And people in at least half of the globe could do it. For years, the rabbi in Hong Kong, the rabbi of the liberal city in Hong Kong, has been saying, won't you come be scholar in residence? And I had no desire to fly to Hong Kong for for a quick weekend and see the synagogue and the hotel and then probably get up back on the plane. But then he asked me to do it on Zoom. So it was wonderful. I taught their Tikkun Leil Shavuot.
Wow.
Shavuot then Sunday night. And I taught their Tikkun Leil Shavuot on Sunday morning because we're 12 hours apart. So I could do it before the Chag and then and then be here for my own holiday. So there are blessings in Zoom obviously as well. It got me to Hong Kong, but that's about as far as I go with it.
I have a question here about what the source is of your lifelong passion and love for Judaism, and how old you were when it was clear to you that it would be your life's work.
I was attracted to Judaism when I was 7 or 8 years old. I don't know why. You could probably explain it in either psychological or spiritual terms, but I was taking my mother to synagogue when I was a little kid. My dad was a militant atheist, thought religion was all nonsense and the opiate of the masses and all that, and I was drawn to it as a young child. I was drawn to the old world. I was drawn to my grandparents' world. I was drawn to all these stories of life in Eastern Europe. I sat struggling with my grandparents' Yiddish newspaper in order to learn Yiddish. I took German in high school to learn Yiddish, and I was very pulled to that world early. I went through a somewhat neurotic adolescent Orthodox period, walked away from it totally, and came back to it again when I was 20 years old, and discovered the mystical tradition. Somebody opened the doors to the mystical tradition to me. I was a student at Brandeis, where a wonderful professor named Alexander Altman taught the first class on Jewish mysticism ever taught in an American university, and I was a kid in the class. Rich may have taken that class 10 years later, I'm not sure. I know Danny Matt did, and many others. And that opened a new doorway to Judaism for me when I was 20. And I've been on that path ever since. But it actually started very young, and I can't quite explain it.
I do remember when I was really young, in the back of the car around the same age, 7 or 8, and looking out the window at the clouds, because we didn't have phones then, cell phones, and thinking, what if God has a message for me in the clouds? And then the next thought was, but what if it's in Hebrew? I think for me, that was the beginning of knowing I had a lot to learn. We have a question here. How do you see the challenges to Judaism related to so many progressive Jews who differentiate culture from religion and keep away from religion and view God and prayer as alien to them, but call themselves cultural Jews? How do we deal with that binary thinking?
Well, we have tried to create a secular cultural Judaism in America. People in the generations of I would say the 1920s to 1950s tried to do that. It was mostly based on two things that failed, Yiddish and leftist politics. And neither one of them was a very good idea in the 1950s and 1960s, when the great reservoir of Yiddish-speaking Jews had been murdered, and it was dangerous to be politically leftist in this country. So Jewish secular Yiddishist culture more or less fell apart after that first post-war generation. I had a branch of my family who were part of that, and I knew it. And there was some beautiful attempts to do it, but it didn't work. Part of the problem is that in America, in this country, which has its terrible racist obsession, where so much is about skin color, in America, ethnicity is defined by color of skin. The American Census Form, at least 10 years ago, was still asking your ethnicity. And you could check off African American, Asian American, Latin American, I think Pacific Islander, Aleutian Islander, Alaskan American, and then it said, or other, parentheses, Caucasian. Which is to say, if it shows in your skin, America cares about your ethnicity. But America doesn't care if you're Italian American or Irish American or Armenian American or Jewish American, because you are all Caucasian, other. And it is somehow expected in America that ethnic identity will eventually melt away. You will marry, Irish Americans will marry Armenian Americans, and Polish Americans will marry will marry French Americans, and that will all be sort of part of your ancient past. We want to survive as a distinct community in this country, and therefore in America, religion is what we're about, because in America, religion remains a sacred cow. Nobody can tell you you must give up your religion in America. Religion is very important. So lots of Jews who didn't really believe joined synagogues in the 1960s and 70s as we moved to the suburbs and declared themselves Jews through the synagogue. And I think if Judaism is going to survive, it will survive mainly as a religious community with ethnic roots in this country. If you ask Jews, most American Jews, what they do as Jews, it will be a Passover Seder and Hanukkah candles and a brief visit to the synagogue on Yom Kippur and a few things like that, which are associated with some kind of, at least what began as religious observance form. What I'm trying to do is to say to lots of American Jews and to Israelis, by the way, this distinction between cultural or secular Judaism and religious Judaism is not what you think it is. You don't have to believe in the old fellow in the sky who's going to punish you if you're a bad child and reward you if you're a good child in order to be a religious person. Religious person means something broader than that. So let's talk about what we might mean by religious language and what we might mean by God. And is there a way for you to find yourself fitting into a new way of understanding what religious, or if the word religious bothers you, let's try spiritual journey within Judaism. Does that work better for you? That's a very American thing to do, be on a spiritual journey. Lots of Americans are on spiritual journeys. And finding a Jewish language for that and showing that Judaism is a language for that is really in some ways what my life work is about.
Thank you. And so many do have practices that they don't always identify as Jewish. For example, they might have a mindful eating practice that they don't realize is harmonizes with eco-kashrut. And so there is a lot of educating to do. I think we have time maybe for 2 more questions that are in the chat. And so these final 2 questions, yes.
That last piece, since I'm still on the screen, I could say something. I think that there is a real opportunity there for making those connections with the kind of more secular cultural pieces, because we know from the Pew studies that are done every however many years, 10 years or so, about religious life, that there are so many Jews who identify as their Jewish actions things that don't have very much religious content, right? But could have religious language or associations with them, like social justice, like humor. So those kinds of values, which the problem with those things is if they don't have a particular Jewish language to them, they are indistinguishable from many other traditions which also believe in social justice and humor. But if we think about those practices as being openings where you can add some kind of Jewish framing to them or Jewish language to them, as you're talking about, that might be different from the language of the Siddur, but might have opportunities to put those things into different kinds of Jewish terms. I think there is an opportunity there because people want some kind of cultural hook to hang things on, but don't know exactly what shape the hook takes that makes it not just a universal hook.
Really powerful. Thank you. We have the last 2 questions here. I've struggled with the traditional notion of a personal God who punishes, judges, is jealous, grants prayers, etc. But is your non-traditional conception of God as a force that is present in all creation, including ourselves, really different? In your new book, you often describe God in terms of human experience and human emotion, such as love. But if God can be described by one human emotion or characteristic, why not others?
Okay, that's a real theological question. When people ask me, "Do you believe that God loves you?" I have to answer it this way. By the way, Maimonides could not say that God loves you because Maimonides said love is a human emotion. And the only love we understand is human love, and God is not capable of human love. So it's very clear that there is a precedent for saying you can say you should love God, but God loves you is very hard to say. I answer it this way. I say I have to give you an answer based on our prayer book, on our liturgy. We have in the morning two blessings we say before the Shema. One is Yotzer Or, we thank God for creating light, and the other is the blessing of love, Ahava Rabbah. And I like to say the first blessing, God creates light. God sends light into the world. I think of the trees in the forest, and I think of the trees in the forest all reaching up to get some of that sunlight. And they reach higher and higher, and they grab a little bit of that light, and they get to send their roots down at the same time to find water. And they take that light and convert it into chlorophyll. And that chlorophyll gives them life. The chlorophyll is the energy that gives them life and makes them trees. We reach for that same, in the second blessing called love, we reach for that same light. God doesn't do anything different. The same light shines into the world. We do the same thing. We reach for that light and we convert it into love, which is our chlorophyll, which is our stuff of life. And it allows us to live and us to continue and us to produce. And God does nothing different. It's not that God gives chlorophyll to trees and gives love to humans. That's just the energy that radiates into existence. They call it chlorophyll, we call it light, we call it love.
So beautiful. Thank you. So perhaps just one more question. I'm looking at Devorah so she can nod or shake her head at me. And this is from Rabbi Howard Leibson, who's wonderful to have you with us, who asks, how do you understand pantheism?
Well, I am a kind of panentheist. Pantheism, sort of classically identified with Spinoza, identifies God and world. God is the world is God. And therefore, nature and God are co-equal. Now, some refer to Spinoza as the God-drenched philosopher, and some say no, he's simply defining God out of existence, because God is nothing other than nature. A panentheist is a person who believes God is present in all things, but the one is present in all things, but the one is infinitely more than them. It's more than the total of its parts. We can never know the one. I don't like the word God very much, G-O-D in English. It, after all, is derived from ancient Germanic pagan languages. It refers to the Norse gods originally. Yud-He Vav-He in Hebrew, the word we not allowed to pronounce. Yud-He Vav-He is an impossible conflation of the word to be. It should not be translated G-O-D, it should be translated was as will be. Was as will be. Hayah Hoveh Yehiyeh, all smashed together into a form that doesn't exist, an artificial noun that arrests the verb in motion. That's what it is. So that's the oneness of being for me. That's past, present, and future all at once. That's what I mean by it. And it is unknowable. It is ultimately unknowable. When Moses says to God, "What shall I call you?" God says, "Eheyeh asher eheyeh," I will be whatever I will be, which is to say, he takes that Yud He Vav He and says, if you think you've got me because I'm a noun now, because you have a noun to call me, Eheyeh asher eheyeh, I will go conjugate myself and become a verb again. I will be whatever I will be. You will not grab hold of me in that nominal box to say, okay, now I've got you defined because you're a noun. So therefore, God is not a noun. And therefore is ultimately elusive. And that's why I'm a panentheist and not a pantheist, because I think the one is ultimately elusive, is present in all, but is ultimately beyond us all. But that beyond is a beyond from within. It's not that God lives over there on the other side of the sky. There is no other side of the sky. But it's rather God is present in each thing in such a deep way that we will never be able to fathom it. And therefore it remains mysterious and transcendent. Let me leave it on that high note.
It's so beautiful. Thank you both so much. And you both made me think about how God loves Solomon so much that God gives Solomon a new name, Yedidia, which means friend of God. And I think of Richard as embodying that sense of friendship, friend of humanity and friend of God. And both of you also, your friendship, your wisdom, and your sharing with us is so meaningful. And so we thank you.
Yedidia, but also Yerachmiel, which means something pretty close to it.
And that was Richie's Hebrew name,
Yeah.
Yerachmiel. There are really no words to express my gratitude to Judith, to Art, to Zoe for giving this gift. And this was really a gift. I also want to thank the folks from High Village who thought with me about how to create this day. Andrea Polin, Susan Levine, Sue Rosenblum, Nikki McCurry, and Devorah Servi, our executive director. I also want to thank our sponsors, the Hebrew Union College's Scorval campus in Los Angeles, the Kasdan Institute at USC, and the night program of the Annenberg Center at USC. In conclusion, I just want to say again that this is the month of Elul. The word Elul is connected to that book, Song of Songs, the famous phrase, Ani ladodi v'dodi li, I am my beloved, and my beloved is mine. Ani, it starts with me. It starts with me making the intention to use this month of Elul as preparation for the season of a new beginning. There are lots of practices connected to this month, and one of the primary practices is hearing the shofar. Richie loved the shofar. He loved it not the way it was traditionally sounded at Temple Emmanuel, but the way he felt it should be sounded 100 times in the Rosh Hashanah service. 100 sounds that for him were sounds not just of strength and possibility, but were also sounds of vulnerability. In the last year of his life, he was already sick, but not yet that sick. He somehow found the energy to lead the contemplative service at Temple Emmanuel and to sound the shofar 100 times. The shofar is about waking up. Rich believed that the primary spiritual task for all of us was to stay awake. Maybe that's really why he loved the shofar. But again, he linked the shofar to the truth of a broken heart. All of us who loved Richie and who loved Kathy know what it feels like to have our hearts broken. But through their memories and through the learning that we did today, those broken hearts have become open hearts. And for this, I am very grateful. So stay awake. May the new year bring us all blessings. Much gratitude. Thank you all for being here.